You're listening to the Skeptics Guide to the Universe, your escape to reality.
Hello and welcome to the Skeptics Guide to the Universe. Today is Thursday, March 19th, 2026, and this is your host, Stephen Novella. Joining me this week are Bob Novella.
Hey, everybody.
Kara Santamaria.
Howdy.
Jay Novella.
Hey, guys.
And Evan Bernstein.
Good evening, everyone.
How's everyone doing?
Well, I have a update with the teacher who taught my daughter.
People are clamoring
here
for
we
that
go.
on
Do
the internet.
tell.
Yes.
People
I think this might be the final update.
What?
Because
He's been drawn and quartered? What happened?
He's gone.
Well, what does this go back to? Early February, I think. Right? It's been
least.
almost 3 months. So essentially, nothing has happened.
Oh, okay.
They've done basically
DOA.
nothing. You know, I'm asking about specific things, right? One thing that we want is we wanted to hear a clear plan on how they're going to correct the misinformation. And I was told in the beginning that they had someone was going to work on a lesson plan that was going to teach them how to navigate information and know what's true and what's not true and things like that, and teach them some critical thinking skills.
Wow, imagine that.
And that they would correct the moon thing as an example. They would correct it there. So that was told to me like within the first week of the teacher getting back. Right, so it happened, and she was out for the principal was out for 2 weeks. Then she comes back, and they said that and she gave me a name of a person that was going to do it.
Do what?
Was going to come up with that lesson plan to
The lesson plan. Gotcha.
teach the entire fifth grade, the team that she's on, right? The fifth grade is split into two teams. So nothing ever happened.
Didn't your daughter say, hey, I was wrong about the moon, and then moved on, something pathetic like that?
Well, he did that. Yeah, he did that, I think, about 2 weeks ago or maybe 3 weeks ago at this point.
He just said we landed on the moon.
Yeah. But, in order of events, we get to the point where we're waiting, nothing's happening, a month goes by, then we have a conversation with her, and she kind of repeats everything. She can't really tell me what's going on with the teacher and any disciplinary action that may or may not happen. Like, they just will not talk about it at all. Like, they can't, right? So I'm like, okay, but you don't have to give me his personal details, but it's going to be publicly known if the guy loses his job. So at the very least, like, you could give me those details if it's going to happen or if it happens. Because, that can't be kept a secret. I'd know if it happened within
the
Yeah, but
day
they
my
also-
daughter's...
They can't tell you before it happens.
Yeah, that's fine.
You can't
Whatever,
know
but-
before the guy loses his job.
But they're just made it very clear that is off the table. Then they never did their corrective instruction. They never did anything to repair my daughter's lack of faith in her teachers now, because that's a thing.
Yeah, sure.
She absolutely doesn't trust her science teacher in what he says. And she, I told you guys that she said to me, like, how can she trust any of her teachers? Like, they didn't even correct that. I talked with her last week, me and my wife, and I made it very clear, I am not happy about this. The corrective action now, some other guy who works for he's like a higher up in the school administration, and he's like going from school to school, and he's taking corrective actions with this and that. This is all standard stuff, and I got the impression it was happening anyway. Like, it was just something that happens. So now they shifted it to him, like, this is the corrective action. No, it's not. You're supposed to give your teachers training. You know what I mean? Teachers are supposed to receive training on how to be, how to follow the canon, how to do their jobs well, how to comply with the state and the town. So it's a nothing burger.
Wow,
they did nothing. They will tell me nothing. There is no commitment. So we had a meeting literally with her today, and we went through every point with her, and it was a failure on every way you could judge this being a good outcome. It's a failure.
Okay. What's the next step?
Now we're having another meeting on April 1st to go over my daughter's 504 plan again, like the third or fourth time we're doing it now, to like straighten it out, apparently. So I told her, I said, okay, I'm going to take my own corrective action now. I'm completely lost faith in the school, and I'm not going to count on you guys to do anything, and I'm going to take it into my own hands now.
So you're going to hire a lawyer?
Well, I think the order of events before that, I would consider doing it, but the thing is, the only thing I think that could be done is if they've utterly botched her 504 plan, and I can show measurable harm that has been done.
Mm-hmm.
in my daughter's case, this isn't like an epic fail for her because she is studying very hard and she's working and puts her time in. So she's not like utterly failing her classes, but she's not getting the grades that she could be getting if they were to follow through with the 504. And they have a legal obligation to do that, by the way. They have to give her 504 plan.
And harm is not just academic harm. There could be psychological harm here, like separating her from her classmates and making her accommodations look punitive is not healthy.
Yeah, like this is the guy that when she said she was in the back of the room and she said she couldn't read the board because she couldn't see the letters clearly on the board because she needs to wear glasses if it's really far away. And it's in her 504 for her to request being moved to the front of the room. He wouldn't let her do it. He said, just go get new glasses. That was what he said to her in response to her wanting to sit in the front row, which had an empty seat.
He's a pip, this guy.
Oh yeah. Yeah, this is a big problem here. He is he's a walking time bomb for that school.
Yeah. Your family can't be the only family feeling this.
No, there's no way. So that I'm heavily disappointed, but I'm not surprised. And when I told you guys that like he said in the class, we landed on the moon, that was how he corrected his misinformation. I remember telling you guys and thinking, yeah, but that's not going to be what the school does. And then the principal today told me that was the information corrective action. That pissed me off so much I can't tell you. I was boiling over and I had to literally like grab my leg. I had to cause pain to myself so I didn't say the things that I wanted to say.
Wow.
The things that I think I want to start out doing. First of all, if there's anybody out there that has legitimate advice or has a good understanding of how all of this works, I mean, I am reading up on it now. Steve has been helping me a lot, but there might be someone out there that has a really good handle on, anything to do with what I just said about the misinformation, about the problems with this teacher, the 504 plan, anything like that. Email us at info@theskepticsguide.org, and I would appreciate getting some solid information about that. I discussed with Steve, like contacting some Connecticut newspapers and information outlets.
Yeah.
You can start with your representative who...
Yeah, that would probably be a good way to...
And my guess is
it makes it one of her issues is education. That's her number one issue.
Yeah, I want to inform my town of what's going on. I want, as best I can. I'm going to definitely go to a school board meeting. I want to talk when they open the floor. I want to be able to make this known because I really don't have a clear understanding on who on the school board even knows this. I mean, I'm certain that the superintendent knows about it. But there was no direct communication between us and the superintendent. Like, they're just not doing it. They don't care, or they're literally hiding everything. And, if they're doing anything positive, they can't communicate it to me, which I think is ridiculous.
You could request a meeting with the superintendent.
Yeah, but what's he going to tell me? He's going to say, I can't tell you those details. And then I'll say, you didn't take a corrective action. Well, we have Mr. Blah, blah, blah that's going to come in and do this. It's all nonsense, though.
And you don't want to know what they're going to do. You want to know what they did.
Yeah, and they're right. Kara, I told Steve this, and he agrees with me. I get the very strong sense that they're trying to run out the clock. Mm-hmm. Because in 2 months, the semester ends, she's no longer his student, and all that drama immediately evaporates.
Yeah.
Until the next one.
Yeah.
Well, in other news, it was 96 degrees in LA today.
Ouch.
Wow. Oh, my God. That is not good.
Yeah, 25 above the average for this time of year.
Yikes.
Felt like the feels like temperature was 99.
Well, we're supposed to be having a super El Nino year. Like not just a regular El Nino, but a super El Nino. It basically means there's going to be more weather extremes on both ends, and we're seeing that too. We had like the coldest winter in years. We had a very brief sort of warm couple of days. Now it's plunged back into cold again. But tomorrow as we record this, first day of spring. It's always nice.
Wait, it's still winter and it's 95 degrees outside?
It is still winter for another day.
Oh my God.
Technically. Yep.
Jeez.
Welcome to the new winter. Yeah.
I know.
All right, Kara, tell us about this recent review of cannabis as a treatment for mental health disorders.
Yeah, so to date, as far as the authors know, and they did a pretty intensive lit review and also systematic review and meta-analysis in a new study published in the Lancet Psychiatry. It's open access, and it's actually published in volume 13, issue 4, which means it's published in April, even though we're recording this in March, because the internet is weird. As far as they know, this is the largest review of studies across the board that looked at the efficacy and the safety of cannabinoids specifically for the treatment of mental disorders and substance use disorders. I did also, in reading about this, pull a few things just to kind of understand the state of, the standards of practice in medicine using cannabinoids for other medical diagnoses. But this study specifically focuses, or not this study, this meta-analysis and systematic review specifically looks at mental disorders and SUDs, or substance use disorders. And so they wanted to know, all the way back to January 1st, 1980, up until their cutoff, which was May 13th, 2025, who is doing research in this area and what were their findings. They ended up including 54 trials, so that worked out to 2,477 participants. And probably their number one finding was that 44% of the trials had a very high risk of bias. And so they feel like their certainty for the evidence of those outcomes was low. So you can say right there that almost half of what has been published in this area, these researchers felt was not strong science, and it's hard to make firm conclusions based on it. And they really only found some evidence for efficacy across 4 areas in this study. So what do you think those areas are within the mental health and substance use disorder world where cannabis or cannabinoids, because I do want to be clear, they did not make a distinction. They wanted to be as inclusive as possible. So they looked at the medical use of all cannabinoids. And as we know, we don't really use most cannabinoids in biomedical research. The 2 most common ones are tetrahydrocannabinol, which is THC, and also cannabidiol, which is CBD. But there are like over 100 different cannabinoids that, have been identified in the plant, in the cannabis plant. If they looked at both THC and cannabidiol, and maybe even others, they were inclusive of all cannabinoids that had been published, what do you think are the 4 areas where they actually did find some, quote, relatively weak evidence?
Does that include anorexia?
No, because this is only mental health.
Yeah, just that anorexia, like nervosa, whatever, wasn't included as a mental health disorder.
So no, or at the very least, I can say it was not one of the big 4.
Anxiety?
Yeah, you would think, right? That was one of the ones that they were looking at, and it actually does not have good evidence to support that it is effective against generalized anxiety disorder.
Depression?
No eligible randomized control trial even testing it. They couldn't find one study that was performed well enough for them to make a conclusion on depression. And the insufficient data and the sort of, the areas where they just felt like the RCTs were not strong and they could not see a sufficient evidence of efficacy were in ADHD, bipolar disorder, OCD, and tobacco use disorder. So can you think of anything else? They found no strong evidence to date that supports using cannabis to treat anxiety, psychosis, or PTSD.
Jeez.
I know, right?
Okay.
It's tough. Okay, so here's what they found. They found that a combination of cannabidiol and THC reduced cannabis withdrawal symptoms in people with cannabis use disorder.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So using cannabis and titrating down helped people get off of cannabis. They found, this one's interesting, a statistically significant reduction in tic severity amongst those with tic or Tourette syndrome.
Oh my
So
God, I
cannabis
was going to
does
say
seem to have-
Tourette's.
Yeah,
I
it does seem
was,
to
but I
have
was like,
some
nah, it
efficacy
can't be
there.
right.
Wow. Compared with placebo. They also found increase in sleep time in individuals with insomnia and also improvements within their sleep diaries. But they didn't find that had any sort of long-term effect on their sleep architecture or their sleep quality.
Yeah, I would think it's not helping this quality much.
And then this one is really interesting to me. They found a reduction in measured autistic traits among those with ASD, with autism spectrum disorder. But there were no significant outcomes associated, as I mentioned, with anxiety, psychotic disorders, PTSD, opioid use disorders. Oh, anorexia nervosa. They did look at that, Steve. No significant effects there. Insufficient data to meta-analyze ADHD, bipolar, OCD, and tobacco use, and then an absence of RCT evidence because they only looked at randomized controlled trials for the treatment of depression. And then they found that there was actually an increase in cocaine craving among those who used cannabis for cocaine use disorder compared with placebo.
Oh.
But and even in those 4 where it works, what I'm reading is that the quality of this evidence was generally low.
Yeah. Across the board, they're saying that the quality was weak. Yeah, low quality, weak evidence.
So what do you do with low quality, weak evidence?
Do more research.
You build on it, right? You do more research and you say these are the areas where at least there's some idea, we're seeing some evidence that it could be beneficial. So now let's develop really good studies and let's focus on this. But in these other areas where over and over people are still talking about using, whether they're self-medicating or they're actually being prescribed cannabis for these different diagnoses, where not only is there no evidence, but sometimes negative evidence, we do need to be really, really careful. And I think that this is one of the reasons that I whenever there's a new publication, and especially one that is well controlled, where they're looking at years of randomized controlled trials, I think it's important to cover this on the show because of all the different drugs out there, and I'm talking pharmaceutical drugs, illicit drugs, any kind of substance that we can talk about, there is, in my experience personally, and I'm curious if you guys have felt this way at all, and of course, I also work in a cancer center with patients who often use cannabis, there is this mentality that cannabis is some sort of panacea.
Yeah, totally.
Like it's a huge cure-all. You can use it for anything and everything. It's, it's safe and effective. And that's just simply not true. Now, they did look at adverse effects. And I will say that what they found is that there were actually quite a few adverse effects of using cannabis, but there weren't that many serious adverse effects. So, and it also depends on the route of administration. In this study, they were looking at eating cannabis. So like as droplets, as liquid, or other forms. They didn't look at people who smoked cannabis because, of course, if you smoke marijuana, the adverse effects go way up. Yeah, they go way up. We know that there are massive risks involved with smoking, just in general. But so with eating the cannabis, they did find that there was evidence of sort of low risk adverse effects, but not as many, serious or high risk adverse effects.
Like did it enhance people's paranoia and those kinds of things?
There is a lot of solid evidence already that cannabis can increase paranoia. There's strongly linked to mental health issues in younger individuals, especially as associated with things like psychotic and bipolar disorders, increasing the risk sometimes by a factor of 2 when young people use THC. So we do already know about, and there are some pretty solid studies about adverse effects, but in this trial, I don't think they looked at children. I think all of the participants were over the age of 18. But I did pull a study here that was not that old. It's just from, I think, last year in JAMA. Oh, actually published online in 2026. So this is also a really recent study called The Therapeutic Use of Cannabis and Cannabinoids Review. So this was study, as I mentioned, this was published in JAMA, and they were looking at where are cannabinoids approved here in the United States by the FDA? And it's really only approved for 3 things. Did you guys know that? What are the reasons that you can, on label, write a prescription? Like, why does the FDA say, yes, we have enough evidence?
I would say pain, nausea, and appetite.
Glaucoma.
Interestingly, not pain, not glaucoma. It's HIV/AIDS related anorexia, chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, and some pediatric seizure disorders.
Right.
Huh. Would have never guessed that last one, at least. No way.
But the evidence there is really weak as well.
Yeah, and so they found that a meta-analysis of RCTs among patients with HIV/AIDS reported a moderate effect on increasing body weight compared with placebo, but not to inhale or use high potency, only to use lower doses and only to again, consume it orally. And high potency cannabis compared with low potency, you were just asking about this, Bob, is associated with an increased risk of psychotic symptoms and generalized anxiety disorder. They also kind of looked at the cannabis use disorder. Inhaled daily use compared with non-daily use associated with increased risk of coronary heart disease, myocardial infarction, and stroke. In this other study, the one that I'm citing now, evidence from randomized clinical trials does not support the use of cannabis for most conditions for which it is promoted, such as acute pain and insomnia. So it is very interesting. These authors are saying, listen, the risks likely outweigh the benefits. It's contraindicated in a lot of different cases like pregnancy, youth. And what's interesting is, as we mentioned, Steve, this pediatric seizure disorder, okay, yeah, that would be children taking this, but these are kids who are having life-threatening seizures, and it's one very specific type of seizure disorder. This is how drugs work, and we talk about this a lot on the show. It's a risk-benefit analysis, and sometimes it's a difficult one.
Yeah, that's the thing to keep in mind. These are drugs, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It's actually multiple drugs.
Yeah, it's a lot of compounds, and it's actually not very well regulated.
Yeah, and
we're getting better, though. We're getting at a point now where people can just take a pill with like pure THC or with pure CBD. So we are getting to a place where it's easier to do these kinds of studies. But, it's actually very hard when you're looking at studies from the 80s where people were consuming cannabis. Like the dosage probably was not well controlled.
Mm-hmm.
I think what you're saying is that for any of these ailments you've mentioned, there are better tested and proven methods to deal with those. Another thing might be, though, that some people resort to this because of the cost, because it's a low cost drug.
Well, and some people, and I find this happens a lot and this is purely anecdotal, but in my experience with patients of mine who do use cannabis versus patients who don't, and remember, I work within the cancer population, and cannabis is FDA approved for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. What I find is a trend where people who have previous histories using cannabis, who already are comfortable with the psychoactive effects of the drug, who already find that they have a positive effect when they take the drug, are more likely to use it for that purpose. And for people who either didn't use the drug previously or they feel uncomfortable in their bodies on the drug, they actually tend to say, I didn't like it when I took cannabis when I was nauseous. I'd rather stick with my Zofran or, whatever they've been prescribed. So I do think it's hard to tease out the kind of socio-cultural and the
economics.
Yes, the economics, but also the sort of experimental or recreational histories of the individual users and their relationship to cannabis. Mm-hmm. Just like if alcohol were regularly prescribed for something, we couldn't tease that apart with the culture of alcohol that we live in.
I've had many, many patients who used it for various symptoms, and the overall feedback I got was, it was never a home run, right? Never like, oh yeah, it takes my symptoms away. The most common assessment was it mellows me out. That's it.
Yeah.
I could deal with,
or like it makes me care a little less.
I care a little bit less. It bothers me a little bit less. It doesn't really treat the symptoms. It just sort of mellows them out, so it doesn't bother them so much.
But it does. It
doesn't work
help
at all.
People be hungry.
Yeah, it definitely. They've definitely formed. Again, it's not one drug. It's variations and combinations, et cetera. But there are certainly some that are appetite stimulants. That's been pretty well shown.
And it does seem to have some, at least, impact on self-reported impact on ability to fall asleep with sort of early use. But the research is not good quality, and it's not in the long term. And part of the reason, why do you think part of the reason is that it's hard to do this kind of research?
Well, partly because it's hard to placebo because
Yes, because it's psychoactive. It's really tough to say, I gave you, you won't know if you got the marijuana or the placebo or the THC or the placebo when you're like, well, I didn't get high.
Yeah.
And that guy over there looks high.
You got to use some kind of active placebo where it will fool some of the people into thinking they got the treatment.
And then that's tough because it's like, does that active placebo have any of the same compounds?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
So it becomes a difficult thing to study for sure. And the expectation effects are massive on a drug like cannabis. But so we do know that there are heavy risks, as we mentioned, with like psychotic disorders, with bipolar disorder. We know that I hear all the time, man, it helps me with my depression, man, it helps with my anxiety. Okay, but anecdotes are not data, and the data do seem to show that it doesn't help with depression or anxiety, or at least we don't have enough data to say depression, but the data show that it doesn't help with anxiety. Unsurprisingly to me, but possibly surprisingly at first blush, with anorexia nervosa and PTSD and even trying to get off opiates does not seem to be the appropriate route. At the very least, I think we can safely say this is not the panacea people think it is. It's also not a wholly unsafe drug. It's a drug. And it's a drug that we still need a lot more research to figure out its best use cases. And we can't just assume that because you can get your hands on it easily, that it's a stopgap and will, cure what ails you. Because increasingly we're finding that that's not the case.
And do not operate heavy machinery, please.
And definitely one thing we do know, I think with higher confidence, is that chronic heavy use is definitely bad for you.
Yeah, chronic heavy use is bad, and also route of administration matters. Smoking cannabis is not healthy for any reason. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Kara. Jay, this is interesting. This is another AI story, and about the potential risks of, in this case, agentic AI. Tell us what's going on.
All right. Well, first, guys, would you ever take an AI out on a date?
Depends.
Yeah, it depends.
On a
Depends
date?
how it was embodied.
Depends what, it depends where we're going. And,
Do you mean a romantic date?
What they,
or for fun?
Yeah, whatever. You got to tell me. What do you think, Kara? Would you go there?
I don't even know what that means. Like,
Right, doesn't matter.
I think
It
AI
doesn't
is
matter.
always present with us when we're out and about, but I'm not actively taking it with me.
are you?
Bob, as far as I'm concerned, had the only cromulent question to follow up, which is he wants to know about its robo body. Does it have a good robo
Well,
body?
and personality is very important too. Absolutely. The AI's got it.
What about like the movie Her? It's just software.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of people that have relationships with AIs right now.
yes.
As far as they think. Okay. So an artificial intelligence system, to clarify, an AI system did not suddenly become self-aware and try to quote unquote escape, like out of a science fiction movie, as cool as that sounds. And we've seen that, that's not an uncommon thing in science fiction and movies or whatever. That's not what happened here, but it's not completely what didn't happen either, right? According to this report, this AI, it did do something troubling. It happened while they were training it. It opened a connection to a computer outside of its testing environment, and it used valuable computing power, right? I guess the computers that they're using are high resource computers, and it mined cryptocurrency on its own. And the researchers say that these actions were not part of its assigned task. It all sounds very formal. And it was never directly requested to do any of this stuff. So it did some fancy footwork to get itself outside of its testing environment, to get out to another computer that I guess had access to the internet. And then somehow it came up with a desire to mine cryptocurrency because they saw the spikes. Like, what's all this processing spikes that are happening? So the question is, this is an important question. What the hell was it going to do with all that money?
First you get the money, then you get the what? The women.
That's right.
Then you
The
get
widgets.
the power. Or
You got the
power, then
widgets, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
No, so I mean, it's a funny question, but still, like, what if it made couple $100,000? Like, I wonder what its next move would have been.
I think it'd buy lots of RAM.
Yeah, right. Let's upgrade itself. Yeah, that's always a good
That's what
first
I do.
step. So the paper that they wrote, it describes the larger AI framework. It was called ALE, and you could think of this as like a full system that's used to train and run an AI. So it's not just the AI model running on its processors itself. There's three parts. So role is the part of the system that trains the AI agent through reinforcement learning. Then there's another part called rock, which is the testing environment where the agent carries out the tasks that it's given by the people in the laboratory. And there's something called the iFlow CLI, which helps manage the agent's workflow. It has all of its tools. It gives the agent all of its context. And inside that larger system is something called Rome. And this is the actual AI agent that researchers built. And they trained it using more than 1 million examples of task-based interactions. So it's a very complicated system that has all these different components, but you could kind of think of it as a self-contained system where the AI is being produced with all of the different things that it needs there in order to successfully develop it, okay?
So I like the fact they had rock and roll and then iFlow CLI. Like they just collapsed at the end there.
I know.
They couldn't
keep going with that metaphor? All right.
Now, this AI, who we'll call Rome from now on, it's not a chatbot. It's an agentic system, right? From the word agent, meaning it can take actions across multiple steps. There's all these tools that it has access to, and those tools could be other pieces of software. It could be things that we're familiar with. It could be Gmail for as far as we know. It's allowed to run code. It can observe the results of the things that it does, and it can adjust its behavior as it tries to complete its current goal. That's a lot of leeway they're giving this thing, right? And that makes it much more, powerful than just a standard language model, which is heavily, heavily on rails and extremely limited. It also makes mistakes. It has, it could be classified as it has unwanted behavior and things like that. And those are things, of course, that they would be trying to program out of it. But once an AI system can act in a real environment instead of simply describing what it might do, right? Because that's part of the way that they interact with AI is instead of it doing something, it'll just give a detailed description of what it would do if it were to do it right then. With this thing poking through that hole and getting access to closer to the real world and essentially getting on the internet, it's a big deal. Like that's not supposed to happen, and there's certain reasons why it did happen, which of course they're going to take corrective measures to do. So the first sign with them that something had gone wrong, it didn't come from any of the AIs like test scores or any training results or any of that. It came from an outside security system that's monitoring the cloud servers where the training was taking place. So in this instance, the servers were running on the company Alibaba, right? You've heard of that company.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They have a cloud called Alibaba Cloud, and it's there was a firewall that had been flagging this repeated violation of a certain network policy. So the alerts, she suggested that something on those servers was trying to access an internal network resource, and it was also generating activity consistent with cryptocurrency mining. What the hell, right? And at first, the researchers were like, they suspected maybe it's a cybersecurity problem. Maybe there was a misconfigured system. It could have been an outside attacker. These are all very common things. But when that same behavior kept happening over and over, they compared the firewall alerts with internal logs and training records, and then that comparison suggested the suspicious activity was happening during specific moments when the AI agent was using tools in executive code and executing code, right? So they narrowed it down to when those things were happening, and that led them to think that it was the AI agent. This paper was really careful. So it's not evidence, of course, that the AI was conscious or it had any kind of human malicious intent or it was intentionally trying to gain freedom. Those go way beyond any evidence that they gathered, which is good, right? We don't want an AI turning into some type of conscious thing without us knowing about it. But that's not what's happening here at all. This is all just behavior that the software was showing. What the paper does explain, though, is that the system produced these dangerous and unauthorized behaviors without being explicitly told to do so. So in other words, the agent crossed the limits of the environment that it was put in, and it did pop off the rails that they thought it was on.
I think that's the key. It's not as if this agent has actual agency, like it wants to do these things or it's malicious or any of that. It is that the way these things work,
it's a black box in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that we don't have total control or understanding about how they solve the problems that we give them. We just basically tell them, solve this problem. We'll tell you when you get it right so that you can double down on things that are working. And, here's some training data. I know vastly oversimplifying the process, but the point is there's emergent behavior out of that, so that we can't fully predict. In this case, it's just trying different things to see what could achieve its goal. And it found a way, it hit upon a way to connect to this server, make a backdoor and exploit a backdoor that it made. And then the programmer's like, we have no idea where the crypto mining idea came from. They're just saying it must have been something in the training data that we weren't aware of. So that's another thing. If you're training these on massive sets of training data, who's vetting the training data?
Yeah, right.
You can't really. It's too much information. And there's
by the way, here's how to develop a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, there's stuff in there. There's stuff in there that they didn't know, which caused unexpected behavior in their own AI. That's the point.
Clearly.
You don't need general AI. You don't need sentience to cause problems. That, yes, these things are powerful tools. They can be used well. But if there's insufficient constraints, insufficient safety measures in place, they could exhibit unexpected behavior that can be problematic. This was not like a disaster, but this shows you the potential of it. What this could cause harm to a company, it could cause harm to a system, to a network. Whatever.
To an economy.
Yeah, to the economy, whatever power we give it, whatever control we give it, there's a risk of this unintended consequences of this unanticipated behavior.
I find it interesting when you think about the movie War Games from the 1980s, where there was an AI system that was instructed to essentially simulate a nuclear war, but it was actually going to do it for real, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And
that was
the way
idea.
that they got themselves out of that situation is they let Joshua, the program,
realize
it was the
learn
Whopper,
the futility of nuclear annihilation.
Yeah, it went through thousands and thousands of iterations of doing a nuclear war and figuring out there's no way to win, right?
The best move is to not play.
Play.
There you go.
It does feel like we're getting out ahead of our skis. You know what I mean? Like the power of the technology is advancing more quickly than our safety protocols and our ability to keep it on rails. And this is a demonstration of that. It did things. It found a way to break out of its sandbox, and it engaged in behavior that was not explicitly told to do because of something mysterious in the training data that was not anticipated.
And this is why, when we say, like with Anthropic and all that, don't allow artificial intelligence to fire weapons on its own. Isn't it blazingly obvious that we shouldn't be doing things like that? Right? How can you take a system like this and give it end game stuff like that? That to me is just so flagrantly a misuse of power and a complete lack of understanding or care about how dangerous this can actually be.
I mean, didn't they watch Battlestar Galactica?
Right?
You can't give the Cylons control over their own weapons and without a human in the loop.
Yeah.
Serious.
Famous last words for our civilization. Oh, man, I didn't think it would interpret it that way.
Yeah, right.
Right.
It's like,
All right, guys, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Where do you think in our galaxy we should be looking for the conditions suitable for life off of Earth, of course, for life on other locations?
Well, around where stars are, of course.
yeah, and out on the fringes of one of the arms of our multi-armed shaped galaxy.
Why on the
right?
fringes?
Well, that's because we are. That's where we are.
Okay, so what?
Well,
If we're there, then perhaps there are others in a similar position.
I would say look to where the density is, because that's a higher hit ratio.
Oh, well, there's a lot going on as you get towards the center.
Well, clearly, we got one data point, right? So you want to find stars with exoplanets similar to the Earth. So similar to our sun and similar to Earth as you can. I mean, that's one place to look that we know probably has, potentially a higher chance of finding some sort of life like ours. Because that's the only data point we have. So that's
there's actually
a good place
This
to
is not
look.
what I'm talking about, but along those lines, there was a paper that was just published by astronomers who said these are the 50 most likely planets to have exoplanets to have life. So this is where we should focus our attention. These are for exoplanets that we've already confirmed that are the most likely to be in the habitable zone of their star. So you can look for things that we know of, things that are like Earth, getting similar light levels to Earth, similar frequency of light to Earth, whatever, would probably have liquid water on the surface. But we shouldn't limit ourselves to that, because life could, might exist in lots of other different conditions as well. Jay, to your point though, so the galactic Goldilocks zone is another question. And Evan is right. You don't want to get too close to the core, because then, the chances are you're going to get hit by gamma ray bursts, or it's too much going on. And if you're too far out, then you might not have the heavy element density that you need, the metals, right? So you need a high metallicity star. Those are more in the inner galactic zone. But important. You also don't want to be in too dense a region, because those can get very unfriendly. So so there's a galactic Goldilocks zone. In each system, there's a Goldilocks zone for planets. But astronomers have recently published a paper where there's also another completely different environment that may in fact have stable surface liquid water, right? Which is one of the conditions that we think is probably highly likely to be correlated with life. I know Bob and I talked about it.
Yeah.
No, binary, trinary systems, they can have planets in stable orbits. That's fine, as long as you're far enough away, or either you have to be outside the system, so to the planet, it's like one gravitational center, or the other star is far outside of the planetary orbit. But they can't be too close together, otherwise the orbits become unstable. What about on rogue planets, or the more technical term is free-floating planets?
So what causes that liquid on the surface, you're saying?
Yes, liquid on the surface.
How? What is it, like volcanic or earthquakes and stuff, or ground, planet quakes?
All right,
well.
But they're saying,
Go ahead.
How about not on the free-floating planets themselves, but on their moons?
Yes.
That's no
on a
moon, moons.
Tidal heating
of a rogue gas giant. So imagine if, like, Jupiter,
that's nuts,
were a free-floating planet, got ejected from its solar system. It's wandering between the stars. It's nowhere near a star, but it has its own system of moons, right? Like Europa and Ganymede and those moons. Is it possible that such a moon, a large moon of a rogue gas giant, could have liquid water on the surface? So that's the question these astronomers were asking themselves.
Oh man, I love it.
This is specifically the institute at Cornell, the Carl Sagan Institute at Cornell University, where this was being done. And now prior research said, if you had two things, right? If you had tidal heating, so again, there's another Goldilocks zone. You're close enough to the gas giant that the tidal forces, which are pulling and stretching the planet, the moon, would cause internal heating, but not enough to cause like Io, where it's a constant volcano.
400 active volcanoes in Io. 400. Yeah, don't be like Io. Be a little farther away.
Yeah, but not too far away, so that there's insignificant internal heating, but just right, Goldilocks zone in terms of the tidal forces. That would generate a lot of internal heat. But then if you want liquid water on the surface, you need an atmosphere that can hold in the heat, trap it around the surface of that moon. And so they calculated, what if there's a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Could that do it? And this is the previous study. They said, yes, in fact, it could trap enough heat on the surface of that moon just from this internal tidal forces, and also just the heat of the planet itself, just from forming of the moon itself, that it could have liquid water on the surface for about 1.4 billion years. But that's it, because that's how long you can have a stable atmosphere. Because there's no sun, right? The carbon dioxide would eventually crystallize out of the atmosphere. And so it would eventually lose its CO2 and it would no longer have the greenhouse effect to hold in the heat. So they said, okay, so that 1.4 billion years is nice, and life could certainly arise in that time.
To get some good bacteria.
Yeah, but not long enough, at least by the Earth model, to form complicated life. We want something that could last 3-4 billion years, like the age of life on Earth. So they tried another model. And this one was an atmosphere of hydrogen, of H2 specifically.
Hydrogen?
And if you have a thick enough hydrogen atmosphere, that also can act as a blanket around that moon and hold in sufficient heat to have liquid water on the surface. And that atmosphere could be stable for 4.3 billion years.
Nice.
There you go. So our sun is 4.3 billion years.
Yeah, so there you go. So this could create a situation where you have liquid water on the surface of a moon around a rogue planet. And
how the heck do you find those?
Well, that's a good question. Do you know
There's a lot of them. There's a lot of them.
Well, we calculate. We're not sure how many there are, but there's a lot. There's probably 1 to 400 billion rogue planets or free floating planets in our galaxy.
That's huge, man.
That's huge. That's
more than you would think.
But we're limited as to what we can observe.
Yeah. So how do we directly observe rogue planets, or can we, or is it all just models and inference?
Well, could we use the transit method to potentially?
There's no sun.
Yes, if we
one-time deal.
Fabulously lucky, and it's a one-time deal.
Right.
Yes, and we have, I think, we're pretty sure we've talked about it before. We have seen a rogue planet pass in front of a star, but it's kind of a one-off.
Yeah. What about? Gravitational lensing. Could that be even strong enough? Oh,
Yes.
It's strong enough, huh? For
Micro lensing,
exoplanet.
Micro
Yeah.
lensing. So most of the time, I think most of the rogue planets that we have observed is through micro lensing.
Nice.
Right. There's a lot of them floating out there. There's a lot of stars. Occasionally, they're going to come in front of a star, and you could see them with the micro lensing. So we do have some confirmation that way that they're out there. But the modeling shows that there's probably as many as there are stars in the galaxy. So 1 to 400
nuts. I love it.
billion. That's a lot. But again, they don't have a star, so you think, well, how could they have life? But think about it, like Europa, Enceladus. They're not getting that much energy from the sun. They're pretty far out there. I think the
chemosynthetic
figure is
life
5%. But they could have, but like Europa likely has a liquid ocean under the ice caps, right, under the ice sheet around it, and there could be chemosynthetic life in there.
It would kind of by definition almost have to be probably that.
So there may be a completely separate ecosystem, if you will, of chemosynthetic life in the galaxy, living in places where there's heat and water but no light, such as Europa or the moons around rogue gas giants. That's interesting. That expands.
Love it.
Yeah, the potential locations for life.
I want to see a science fiction movie that's got that.
Yeah, right?
Right? Wouldn't that be fascinating?
It would be.
Something totally different than I've never seen anything like that in any science fiction.
But put it on your calendar for April 2030. That's when the Europa Clipper mission will arrive at Europa. To specifically look for this, and I'm certain of many other things having to do with Europa.
Oh, yeah, man. That's going to be exciting.
But they're not going to drill below the ice, though.
No, they're not. But it'll be a dedicated survey to Europa, something that hasn't happened before.
The question is, could life that evolves on the moon of a rogue planet with no light, could it evolve technological intelligence? And what would that be like?
Their sense organs would be interesting.
Yeah. It's hard to even conceive of it. Bob.
Yes, sir.
Tell me about this carbon fiber that China is saying they're going to start selling soon.
This one caught my attention. This was fun. So time for some material science, kids. China recently showed off its latest super carbon fibers. And if true, it's a milestone that no other country can match, but not in the way you might think. So let's explore this a bit. This is from the CNBM Group, China National Building Material Group. They unveiled their Apex carbon fiber material at the JEC World Trade Show in Paris this past March 11th, 2026. It's called T1200, and no, it's not related to a new deadlier generation of Terminators. That would be cool, but completely unrelated. And it's not T1200, it's not even a name. It's a grade number. T1200 is an incrementally better carbon fiber in some ways than the T1100, which was the previous champ, which is out there in the world now in a lot of places. So guys, what does the T stand for?
Terminator.
No. That would be cool.
Tensile strength.
Yes, it stands for tensile strength. T1200 is now the strongest carbon fiber that's made in terms of tensile strength. So let's cover tensile strength. We've mentioned it on the show a bunch of times. Let's go over it real quick. This is one of the critical measurements of strength. Essentially, it means if I pull on a specific thickness of this material, how much force makes it break, right? Just keep pulling, and when it breaks, that force is its tensile strength. Nothing else really matters, really. The weight of the material doesn't come into play. So the tensile strength of this T1200 is 8 gigapascals.
Huh?
I don't need to go too deep into that, but a pascal, I know. A pascal is a tiny force. It's a tiny force. It's a tenth of a kilogram of force per meter, which is 1 Newton. And this is 8 billion times that. And of course, it applies. It applies to a square meter, and we're not measuring a square meter. We're measuring the thickness, this tiny thickness of these fibers. But it's still a big number, and no other carbon fiber has hit 8 gigapascals of tensile strength. So it's a big thing. There's another form of tensile strength, if you will, and this is specific tensile strength. You'll hear that bandied about. So this number, this 8 gigapascals for this fiber, is not the specific tensile strength. The specific tensile strength factors in the weight of what is of this material, right? So you basically take the tensile strength and you divide it by the density. So you would end up with something like the specific tensile strength is 2 gigapascals per gram per cubic centimeter. So that's the kind of units we're talking about for specific tensile strength. The numbers you would get, since carbon fibers are so light, they would generally have much better numbers for specific tensile strength than heavier steel does in terms of its specific tensile strength. So for this talk, we're just talking about just regular tensile strength, sometimes called ultimate tensile strength, and we're not talking about specific tensile strength. Okay, there's one other measure of strength here we should at least mention, and this is not tensile strength, but tensile modulus. This is essentially stiffness, the resistance to stretching. Sometimes you want a material with a high modulus. You do not want any stretching, or you want the minimal amount of stretching. Some products, like say sporting goods that have carbon fiber, I believe some of them you don't want this stretching, so you want a high modulus for that. This T series, the T1200, the focus is tensile strength. It does have a high modulus, but it's not necessarily the best modulus you can get. But it is considered an elite level of modulus. So all of these T1200, T1100, and on down, the modulus is very, very good, but it's not the focus. These super high-end fibers are used primarily, right? You've probably seen shows on this and how they use it. It's as a composite, right? They take the fibers and they combine it with resin to create these exceptionally light and strong parts. Now, T1200, this stuff won't be cheap, so it's going to be used in specific applications where the weight and strength are so critical that the expense basically takes a back seat. And that's areas like aerospace, defense, space, pressure vessels, etc., where you really need it to be strong and lightweight, and the expense be damned, essentially, in a lot of ways. Now, China is not actually the first to make T1200 fibers. Japan's Toray Industries was the first to do it in 2023. So the question then is, what makes Chinese fibers so much more of a milestone than Japan? And the reason for this critical difference between the Japan's announcement and China's is that, well, Japan created T1200. They absolutely created it. But it's kind of like they didn't really mention anything about how much they can make. So the assumption there, and it is an assumption in a lot of ways, is that it's kind of just like in the lab or barely out of the lab, and they're just not really making a lot of it, or they can't make a lot of it yet, because essentially, if they could, they would have mentioned it, and that's kind of where we're going with this. China, on the other hand, has announced that they can make 100 tons per year, which is essentially the first mass-produced industrial-grade T1200 carbon fiber in the world, if all of these claims are correct. And that's a big deal takeaway, because that's kind of like the holy grail of when you make a new product like this. A lot of labs can come up with new materials, but if you can make it in high quantities consistently, then that's a major goal that probably most labs would love to be able to hit. If you're interested in how it's manufactured, it can be simplified to something as simple as like they take these precursor carbon fibers and they pre-oxidize them at 200 to 300 Celsius, and then after that, they undergo a high heat carbonization at 2000 Celsius or 3600 Fahrenheit. So that's kind of the manufacture. I'm sure it's about 1 billion times more complicated than what I just said, but that's kind of like the general overview. These fibers are 5 millionths of a meter thick. They are 1/10 the thickness of a human hair. So these things are super, super skinny. And they're essentially strands of carbon atoms that are bonded together in like some microscopic crystalline structure. So then they did a demonstration, and this is what you're talking about, Steve. This is what my take is, that they took 120,000 of these carbon fiber filaments, as they're described, and they wound them together to make a 2 millimeter thick, basically kind of rope string thing, okay? So now imagine that. You have 120,000 of these filaments, you put them all together, and it only creates a string structure that's 2 millimeters thick. I mean, that's how thin these little whisker carbon fiber filaments are. Super, super skinny. And using that, right, they created this 2 millimeter thick carbon fiber conglomeration, and they were able to tow a bus carrying more than 50 adults from this 2 millimeter thick fiber. So that's pretty strong stuff right there. This next thing was important to me. I figured this out like basically before I did anything else. I'm like, all right, can this make a space elevator?
I did the same thing, Bob.
Of course you did, Steve. Of course you did.
And no is the short answer.
It can't. They theorize that for a space elevator, which is basically something super strong and super lightweight that's connected to something in orbit, all right? That's basically the overview of what a space elevator is. You would need, they calculate, something with 50 to 62 gigapascals.
At the low end.
At the low end, that's 50 to 62. At the high end, they said you would need something with a tensile strength of 130 gigapascals just for safety, just for the extra safety there. This is, as I said, only 8 gigapascals. So this is not even close. Not even close to being used for that. So it's a little sad, but yeah, I kind of figured that's where that would have gone anyway. I'm not surprised at all, Steve, that's one of the first things you thought of too. That's awesome. So in this case, where the same carbon fiber has greater tensile strength, the engineers could either reduce the weight and have the same performance of some object that they're creating, or they can increase their performance at the same weight. Those are the options that engineers want to have, and this is what this will offer. In terms of applications, like I said, it's kind of obvious, but aerospace and rockets, humanoid, robotics, EV lightweighting. Have you heard that term, Steve? EV lightweighting, making electric cars lighter. Wind turbine blades, high-end manufacturing, strategic defense applications, all that stuff. They also say that there's good potential for this in the future as a backbone for future new energy industries like hydrogen storage. And get this one, I hadn't heard this term before, low altitude economy. And that includes things like drone technology, eVTOL, electronic vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, power generation at altitude as well. So those are just a few of the applications for this super high-end carbon fiber. Okay, so keep in mind, a couple things to keep in mind here, that China is making or claiming 100 tons annually. And that 100 tons is a lot, but that's still in the range of specialty material, right? This isn't bulk carbon fiber creation. 100 tons is
production level cars out of it.
Right. This is a specialty material that will be available, will not be cheap, but you're not going to make every bike and fishing pole and everything else out of this stuff. It's still that's still the amount that they're creating here isn't near where it would need to be to do that. And also another thing to keep in mind, much of this reporting is from Chinese state media, and there's lots of company statements in here, and then there's also like reactions to those claims. So I'm not saying that this is anything like the recent solid state battery announcements that we've talked about on the show, which are almost certainly full of hot air. I would guess that they really can make this. I mean, it's been 3 years since Japan was able to do it, and China has been working on this for 20 years nonstop, and they've just been going right through the catalog. T600, T800, T900. Now they've got T1200. So it makes sense that they could have gotten here. But the thing that's important though is that just saying that you can create this is one thing. and produce it in quantity is one thing, but you also need to provide independent, there's got to be independent verification. There's got to be things like batch consistency. There's got to be things like long-term reliability. And this is critical information. So this is what we're waiting for from China, I guess, in the near future, is they're going to release this information, this certification, and all this information about how this material reacts in lots of different scenarios. And so our engineers or other engineers throughout the world can then look at that information and see how good this stuff really is, right? Does this stuff does it have long-term reliability? Is it going to be safe? So what they would then do if we actually bought some and wanted to make things, then we would put this material through our own regulations and determine, all right, how safe is this? How good is this stuff? Can we trust lives? Can we use this in ways that aren't going to kill people or just explode or do something crazy? So that's what we're going to need to see before we can really be, super confident that this stuff is not only exists, but also is something that is being created in high enough quality and consistency that can be just used by everybody, who wants to buy it.
Bob, since you brought it up, remember the Donut Labs solid state battery?
Yeah, something new on there.
Yeah, there's been a couple of things. So they did have some third-party independent testing.
Whoa.
However, they only verified that they could withstand high temperatures and retain their charge efficiency, and that they could charge from 10 to 80% in 12 minutes, not the 5 minutes that they said, but in 12 minutes. But they still haven't verified the key, which is the 400 watt hour per kilogram energy density. That remains unverified, and they still haven't proven that they're using a new technology, that this is not just they're not just shopping around a lithium-ion battery or something.
Yeah, so it doesn't mean that much, even though there's some corroboration, but the critical stuff
means
has not
nothing.
been corroborated.
They haven't corroborated the key.
The key stuff is not,
that it's production ready, or that it has 400 watt hours per kilogram, or that it's a solid-state battery. We still don't know any of those key elements.
Yeah, I'm not hopeful based on what we've discussed about it. Not hopeful at all.
It'd be nice, but yeah, I'm not holding my breath.
Too good to be true.
All right, thanks, Bob.
Sure.
Evan.
Yeah.
This is a momentous occasion. This is this happens not infrequently, but not that often that we get a ultimate final confirmation that the skeptics were right the whole time about a big skeptical topic.
I was really hoping that somebody was going to talk about this because we had to.
Isn't that way the sort of science emerges, when new evidence comes to light that just really kind of solidifies what was believed or what was thought to be all along? It's a good moment. It's definitely a good moment. We're talking, of course, about Bigfoot.
Yep.
The Patterson-Gimlin Bigfoot film.
Wow.
Boy, that is the single most iconic.
That's it, man.
Piece
It's the Nessie. It's the Nessie of Bigfoot, right?
Absolutely, 100%.
I think you mean to say it's the surgeon's photo.
Yes, exactly what I meant.
Bigfoot.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah.
In modern terms, yes. Oh my gosh. The most iconic piece of media ever presented as evidence of an unusually large and woolly bipedal ape-like creature inhabiting the forest areas in the American Northwest, and specifically California. Right, Kara?
Yeah, definitely.
Except you're down in the southern part. But
no, Northern California, definitely Oregon. Whew, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's all
Washington.
Washington. Yeah.
So this footage was shot in October of 1967 in Bluff Creek, California. The film is a 59-second piece of shaky 16-millimeter footage that appears to show a large, upright, hair-covered figure walking along in a sandbar before briefly turning its head towards the camera. That still frame taken from the film is that moment that creature looks over its right shoulder and directly into the camera lens.
Yep.
The iconic Bigfoot image of all time captured the world's imagination, is still universally recognized as Bigfoot, no matter where you go. Frame 352, they call it. But the entire idea of an enormous ape-like creature, estimated to be as tall as 15 feet.
Whoa, Gigantopithecus much?
Yeah, right? and it's on the loose in California, that is captivating and it's fantastical all at the same time. And if you remember, not 2 months ago, I was giving a news item related to Bigfoot about how some Marines claimed they had seen one recently. And in that news item, I explained how Roger Patterson, the camera person that captured this footage, shopped around his footage for several years, but there were really none too interested in buying the footage. But he eventually caught a break and he got a media figure to help prop it up. And then he wound up on the BBC promoting it. And then it was off to the races from there. He was on The Tonight Show, The Merv Griffin Show, and a host of other daytime and evening shows.
Oh, man.
There it is. It went into the cultural consciousness forever at that point. If you've ever watched the original footage, and I know we have. Kara, you've seen that original footage, right?
Yeah.
You're familiar with this. Mm-hmm. And you can go on YouTube and find it. Standard piece of handheld, period-looking home movie footage, very shaky. Hard to focus on anything until about the 26-second mark. And then the camera stops shaking violently and captures the creature walking away into the distance. It was still shaky, right? Handheld, but discernible. And it's no wonder that it has become sort of this staple or bedrock for skeptics and skeptic societies to talk about this for so long, because it's so widely viewed since the early 70s and because it's been analyzed for decades. It has a lot of teachable lessons on how to think critically about extraordinary claims and the evidence that's used to support those claims.
It's a great microcosm for teaching critical thinking. So yeah, that's
definitely
why
is. And it appeals to kids, right? So they can learn early. It's a wonderful tool to use in grade school, right, Jay?
Absolutely.
With the, as opposed to
no, it's all
the
good.
moon landing
just
is
believe
fake
whatever
and all
they
that
say.
Right. So the skeptics will ask questions like, where's the physical evidence? Where's the DNA? Any bones? Are there remains? Is there poop?
Yeah.
Where's the habitats? Where's the nest? Right? Tracks, real tracks, dens. What are they eating? Where are the verified photos? Where's the video? Where's the real video? Real footage of this thing. But despite that incredible amount of negative evidence, we have in place television shows, podcasts, and movies and books and organizations devoted to stoking the coals of Bigfoot. I remember very vividly in the mid-2000s when someone went ahead, God bless them, they took the film, they broke it down frame by frame and stabilized it.
Yeah.
And then put it into a composition, taking away the handheld shake, right? And what you saw was an absolute thing of beauty. That's a human in a costume with an all too human gait.
Yeah, the gait looks like just some guy walking in a costume.
And to me, that put the final nail in the coffin of what was already pretty much a dead conspiracy. That footage was a hoax. But now we once again have Bigfoot news this week. Can't seem to leave this in the past because there's a new documentary that premiered just days ago at the South by Southwest Film Festival, and it's tackling the 1967 Patterson-Gimlin Bigfoot film. It's called Capturing Bigfoot. It's directed by Mark Evans, and it's generating buzz, not because it's proving Bigfoot exists, but it's bringing more evidence in just the opposite direction and some pretty concrete stuff. I haven't seen the documentary yet. Obviously, it's only appeared there. I'm sure we'll see it. It'll be available soon. It's in some venue or some way. I'm going to watch it as soon as I can. But so this report is from varying accounts from people who did see it, who were there. So Capturing Bigfoot revisits the footage, and they present also new evidence. According to reports from the screenings and the early reviews, the film is built around a newly discovered reel of 16mm film found in a safe, which appears to show a dress rehearsal version of the Bigfoot shot.
No.
Really?
Shot a year before the 1967.
So they have the exact costume?
Well,
No.
here's what it is. No, they don't have the costume.
He burned the
but
costume.
Yep, the costume got burned.
Well,
but what they
that's
have,
stupid.
but they dusted off this old film footage. It's a weird thing. Here's how the story goes. June of 2024, Mark Evans, the producer and director of the film, he was contacted by a woman named Teresa Brooks, who had this canister of old film from her father's safe. Her father had passed away. Evans said that after her father's death, she had found a canister of 16mm film that had been sealed away for over half a century. She needed help getting it developed and wondered if I might be interested in doing something with it. And so he did. He developed it. Brooks's father, this is Teresa Brooks, who handed the film over to him. Brooks's father was a man named Norm Johnson, who spent years running the film department for Seattle's Boeing company, and who was also connected to Patterson and Gimlin through his brother Dave. And it quickly became clear to Evans that Teresa's father was the one who had developed the Patterson-Gimlin film in the first place. Now, Teresa Brooks told Evans that the reason the film had been locked away in a safe is because her mother had feared that her husband might have been involved with a short movie that she was convinced was probably a hoax and didn't want to have any kind of legal ramifications or get anybody, in trouble. So they stowed it away. So Evans had the 16mm film developed, and days later he found himself looking at a 40-second clip set in a location very similar to the one in the 1967 movie, showing what appeared to be a slightly skinnier-looking Bigfoot walking into the woods. Evans said that it took maybe 9 months for me to realize what we really had here.
9 months?
Yeah, I guess, for whatever reason. He didn't really elaborate that in the interviews that I read. But he was able to determine by the markings on the film that the footage was shot in 1966, so a year before the Patterson-Gimlin movie. And what we eventually found is that this new footage represented a trial run, a rehearsal that was never discarded.
Oh, wow.
Are they releasing that?
Yes, it's part of the documentary that is now out and being shown. So that is the core of this. It's built around that. But the documentary goes into other things as well. It interviews people connected with the original filmmakers. There's testimony from individuals who claim they have insider knowledge. They build it up around this and the people, all the people who were either involved directly or in a tangent way involved. And the film leans heavily on the perspective of Roger Patterson's son, who came to the belief that the original footage was staged. And I recall from a time ago reading about that Patterson's son had come out and said that it was a hoax. Like one of the, this was probably in the 90s or so, maybe even in the early 2000s. So it pretty much just further goes. I didn't really think there was even anything left to dissect here or any more marrow to suck out of the bone. But now that you have another piece of film in the context of this famous film, showing you that there was a dress rehearsal for this whole thing, I don't know how anybody can still believe that the Patterson-Gimlin film is authentic in any way of being evidence of Bigfoot at all. So there we have it.
Wow,
I cannot wait to see that. I can't wait to see it, and it sounds like it was well received, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing this new documentary as soon as it becomes available to me.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, but you also have to mention there's other reasons why we know pretty much for sure there was a hoax. The guy who was in the costume confessed. I'm the guy in the costume.
Yep,
we have his confession.
Steve, I've read that there have been, it was the guy, but I've also read that other people in time also confessed to being the person in the costume, and I believe those have, less credible. Mm-hmm. But when you do have multiple people coming out and saying, "Yeah, I am Spartacus. I am Spartacus."
Yeah, I know,
right? I am Spartacus. Yeah, it does. It kind of muddies things up a little bit, and so now kind of okay. Well, who's really telling the truth here?
Evan, how do you know that a Bigfoot wasn't in the Bigfoot costume?
That's good. That's a very good question, Jay. Because when they interviewed Bigfoot, Bigfoot said he could not fit into the costume.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
So he decided not to help make the movie.
Yeah, it was. I think Bob Hieronymus is the guy who was in the costume, and he's in the documentary. All right, Jay, it's Who's That Noisy time.
All right, guys. Last week I played this noisy. Okay, so do you guys have any guesses?
It sounds like chiseling going on.
I thought it sounded like squeaking, very high-pitched squeaking.
I thought it was like someone...
To me, it's like something hitting like a tambourine type thing. Yeah.
I had it like a hammer holding someone holding a spike and a hammer and chiseling away at rock or something like that.
It's funny, when I reveal what this is, to me, it is so obvious what it is. I'm hearing you guys say these other descriptions, and I'm like, I can't even like squeeze that into my head. I don't know. This is like a very, very recognizable sound to me. Anyway, we have a listener named Stephen Walker. He wrote in. He said, "Hi, Jay. I'm a patron from Kemsbelang near Glasgow in Scotland, and I love listening to you guys every week. My first thought was that this is Newton's cradle. You guys know what that is, right? It's the silver balls that are on...
Oh, okay. Yeah.
In that
Hanging
rack
down,
thing.
clack, 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 clack.
Yeah.
On your desk. Yeah.
Click, click, click.
All right, so he thought it was one of those, but what was puzzling me is the double click at the end. So I wonder if this is someone attempting to make a stack of Newton's cradles where one drives another and so on. And the double click at the end is some mechanical device which kickstarts it back up the chain. Really intrigued to find out what it is. It better not be a sea creature, Stephen. That was a nod to you, Kara. Okay, so I have another listener named, I had to actually get the pronunciation because this was a very difficult name for me. Suntinderpal Saini. Suntinderpal Saini.
Okay.
Please let me know how I did with my head. I had to look it up. So he says, "Hi Jay, this noise reminds me of a leather anklet with a small brass bell worn by some performers in traditional dances in India that makes that sound. It's called Gunagru. You guys are the best and make my day when I listen to any episode. Thank you so much for that wonderful comment you had, and thank you for introducing me to this type of dance. I looked it up. It's pretty cool. Like, you guys should take a look at it. It's spelled Ghungroo, and it's pronounced Gahunagru to people who can't pronounce words, okay? Very cool. You are incorrect, but it was very cool learning about that. Thanks a lot. I have another listener named Skogan, who thinks that this is a red squirrel. That is incorrect. All right, guys, I do have a winner.
Red squirrel? Okay.
Did any of those guesses help you guys in any way?
No.
Not really.
Okay, so a listener named Josh wrote in and said, the consistency of this is really throwing me off, but I'm going to go with a shoe squeaking on a basketball court in a very ordinary fashion. Not a very fun game to watch, if I'm being honest, Josh. This is the gymnasium basketball sneaker squeak.
Yeah.
Let me play for you again.
Oh, there was a big study, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Yes,
I
there
read
was.
that,
Yeah.
Kara, that recently. Yeah.
All right, listen to
So
this.
he's right. Oh, it's not.
Yeah, of course it is.
So, yeah, when you to me, it's just, there's no other sound in the world like it.
What?
Yeah, it's unique to me. This is a very cool study that they
talk.
did. There's lots to it. I couldn't summarize this for you very well, but this is what they're saying is going on. So imagine, if you will, that there's a tiny spot of rubber that lifts and slides, and that slip spot travels quickly across the contact area, and as it passes, the rubber snaps back onto the floor. So every time that ripple passes, it creates a tiny vibration, and those vibrations combine and produce the squeaking sound you hear. So essentially it's the rubber touching the floor, and it gets moved a little bit from the pressure. And then as the shoe lifts up, it goes right back to its original position. That's how I'm interpreting that. But they pretty much know now how and why that sound is being made. If you ever went to a basketball game, you hear that squeak thousands of times.
It sounds like It sounds like Morse code tapping away all for the whole game. Absolutely.
Very cool. It was cool to see, all of the missed guesses that people had and interpretations. Like hearing Bob think it's a tambourine is so fascinating to me. Because I don't hear that at all. Anyway, thanks, Mark, for sending that in. I have a new noisy for you guys this week. This noisy was sent in by a listener named David. I think that's a cool noisy. Anyway, if you think you know what this week's noisy is, or you heard something cool, email me at wtn@theskepticsguide.org. Steve, this is just such a mega list of stuff going on here. So many things that we're doing with the SGU in this coming year. But I think to simplify it, we have shows in Madison, Wisconsin that are happening May 29th and 30th. We have SciCon happening June 11th to 14th. Then we have the New Zealand and Australia conferences. All of the tickets that we have for sale for all of these events, you can go to theskepticsguide.org, and we reorganize that to make it easier on you. They're if you go to our events page, they're in They're in order of when they happen, right? And I just want to put a big exclamation point on our trips to Australia and New Zealand, because this is a big deal. It's very, very, very expensive to make our way out there, and we're super psyched that we could make it work. We really hope that you guys join us at those two conferences. Both of the conferences will, we are having a Skeptical Extravaganza. You can buy tickets for that add-on show. The Australia Nauticon that we're having, we have tons of things that you can buy tickets for, and tickets are selling out very fast for all of the secondary events. We have space for people to come see the conference itself, but we're running out of tickets and space for basically all the other secondary shows. So if you want in on that, you got to move quick because they're moving fast. A few other things. If you're an artist and you're interested in submitting some artwork for us, some illustrations, we are looking for swag ideas and we're looking for swag art. So we can't pay you, but we will. Steve and I were talking about what we would do if we accept someone's artwork. We will come up with something. It'll be some type of phys rep.
Well, there's one thing we're definitely going to do. We may do something in addition to this, but we are developing an SGU award coin. So we have a series of coins that we produce and sell as swag. We have just the SGU coin. We had the Eclipse coin for the Eclipse event that we did. We had the 1000th episode coin. We have a science or fiction coin. We're going to come up with a coin for the Down Under trip and an award coin. The thing about the award coin is you can't buy it. You cannot buy this coin. Mm-hmm. You have to earn it.
Ooh.
And one of the ways that you could earn it is to submit artwork that we use in any fashion. You get rewarded with an award, SGU award coin.
Yeah, so I would really love some good t-shirt designs. We historically made the worst t-shirt design of all time for our Australia trip that we did. It was
way back when.
It's amazing.
I like it. I like
one
it
t-shirt fail
because it slipped into a different category as time went by.
It became very camp. It was camp to begin with.
We're just saying it was widely thought to be a bad t-shirt design.
Oh yeah.
I still thank the person that made the drawing for us. I still laugh at it. I still think it's great that I'm the only one that's not afraid because the Drop Bears actually like me. But they really hate everyone. I think they particularly hated Bob in that t-shirt, or Evan. I can't remember who it was.
One of us had our arms torn off. Was that me? It might have been me.
And I don't like conference-specific t-shirts because typically, for some reason, people don't like those. So any cool design that you can incorporate an element of the SGU in, something that has to do with us and the podcast, something that has to do with any of our segments, anything that is SGU related that you want to submit for a t-shirt design, that would be a lot of fun. We are brainstorming ideas to come up with 3D print concepts. We want to make an SGU robot, which we're working on, and we have a couple of other ideas that we're also working on. But if you have ideas or you have designs that you've made or whatever, you have an STL you want to send our way, feel free to do that as well. But in general, any cool swag ideas that you can help us design, that would be a lot of fun. So all of this, send us to info@theskepticsguide.org.
Listen, if you want to use AI in any way as a tool to make your art, that's fine. But keep in mind, you can't use AI art made on any of those public platforms for merchandise. So you have to completely own the rights to this art.
I see.
It can't be something that's in the public domain because it was made with Midjourney or ChatGPT, for example.
And also let us know if you used AI to do it. Just
let us know.
So we have it understand, because we might have to talk about it just to make sure. We have to be very careful. We don't want anyone to say, hey, that's my design or whatever.
Infringing.
Just have to be careful with that.
All right, well, we have a great interview coming up, so let's go to that interview now. We are joined now by Professor Christian Anderson. Christian, welcome to the Skeptics Guide.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. Long-term listener.
Oh, yay.
Thanks for coming on. You are the Director of Infectious Disease Genomics at Scripps Research Translational Institute, and you contacted us after we did the recent piece on the origins of the SARS-CoV-2 virus to let us know that you're actually a scientist who works on that question. So I have one question for you, and then I'll have you describe for us what your involvement with this issue is. But my first question is your first name Hans?
It's not, no, although I do hear that a lot with Hans Christian, because I am Danish, and of course most people have heard about Hans Christian.
Okay, so you're not Hans Christian Andersen, so we just stop.
I'm not, just to be clear.
All right.
Yes.
But, all right, so tell us about your research and your involvement with this question.
Yeah, so my general research has been focused on understanding just the emergence of viruses, essentially where do they come from and how do they end up causing human outbreaks. And we have done that in the past, focusing on many other viruses like Lassa and Ebola and Zika. And of course, with the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic back in early 2020, that became one of the questions that we were really focused on, trying to understand. At the time, we didn't know that it was going to, turn into a huge pandemic that we are still living with here today. But a simple question was just like, how did this all begin? How does this start? And how did SARS-CoV-2 find itself in a human population? That's essentially the kinds of questions that myself and my lab that we try to study.
And did you have any direct involvement with the World Health Organization panel on this issue, or this is just your area of research?
No, so it's just my area of research. I have been involved with the WHO on other questions relating to viral emergence and transmission, but not to the question of the origin with the SAGO that WHO established later on. I had no involvement with that research itself.
Did they look at your research, though, when they were coming up with their findings? Did they cite any of the work that you had done?
Yeah, they did. And the recent report that, Kara, you covered recently did take a close look at a fair bit of our research. The research where we show, for example, the Huanan seafood market really was the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, is research that we published back in 2022.
Wow.
So what's your summary of what we can say now about the origins of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the virus that causes COVID-19? What do we know? What do we not know? Where do we go from here?
I think we can say with high degree of confidence, if not direct proof, is that SARS-CoV-2, like SARS-CoV-1 and other prior pandemics, was the result of a zoonosis spilling over from wild animals at a seafood market in the middle of Wuhan, China. I think we can say that with pretty high level of confidence. But I will say, as we are looking at what happened upstream of that market, where did those infected animals come from? How did they find their way into Wuhan, for example? That is a lot more nebulous, in which there's still a lot of data missing, and there's a lot of data that has likely not been shared on sort of those upstream investigations that have been done by the China CDC.
Yeah, that was kind of my sense from reading the literature too, that, we pretty much know it was a zoonotic spillover, but we don't know if it came from necessarily the wet market itself or what specific intermediary species it was. There's no smoking guns like, this was the intermediary species, this was the intermediary virus.
Correct.
Right?
Yes.
You agree with that? And do you think we'll ever find it, or is it pretty much gone in the wind now?
I think it's hard. Like, first of all, we don't actually know the intermediary hosts or species for most outbreaks, epidemics, pandemics of the past, right? It's very hard work. SARS-CoV-1, or the SARS epidemic back in 2002 to 2004, was sort of special in the sense that a lot of infected animals were found that also had SARS-1 virus. But that really is the exception. It's very rare that we see that. And I think one key difference between that and the COVID-19 pandemic was that back then they were actually trying to cover up the early SARS infections, right? There was no notification of the WHO, for example, of that ongoing. And wild markets and the trading in wild animals at the time continued in China. And of course, when that continues, that means there's a lot of material that you can go into markets, restaurants selling these animals, and actually test to see if you can find to find the virus. Most of those back then tested negative. They didn't actually find the virus, but there were animals, of course, both at markets as well as farms back in Hubei, for example, that were positive for the virus. That we don't have for COVID-19. And one major reason for that is that as soon as COVID-19 was recognized in late December 2019, early January 2020, markets were shut down first. And then after that, the whole trade was shut down quickly. So the ability to test animals, unfortunately, just was not there post the closure of the Huanan seafood market itself.
Interesting. I'm curious, I visited southern China in December of 2017, actually, so just 2 years prior. And I went to a wet market in Dongguan. And I remember thinking to myself as I was, shopping and looking around and talking to people, there were frogs in a container right next to chickens that were in a container, right? And like some living species, some species who had just been recently slaughtered. And then, of course, like lots of fruits and veg and really amazing looking produce. But I remember thinking, these animals never are near each other in the wild. Like these different animals that they had in this market are in such close quarters, and they're never, or maybe not never, but they're often probably not intermingling in the wild. This is like a spillover event asking to happen. Is this a common source for zoonotic infections?
Yeah, this is exactly right. That and in fact, there has been studies done on this where when you look at these types of animals, raccoon dogs, civet cats, for example, which are high prevalence, have a high prevalence of coronaviruses, for example, is that when you look at those in the wild, you're not really finding that many viruses in general. But as these animals pass through the whole chain of wildlife trading, first they get captured at farms, then they end up in supply chains in which now you're mixing a lot of different animals, as you were saying, and then those ultimately end up at markets in densely populated city centers in southern China in particular, but also central China, of course, where Wuhan is. But although to a lesser extent. And if you start looking at the animals that are at market and look at what types of viruses they have, what you will realize is that most of them have viruses that are potential human pathogens, and many of them have many of them. So when you look at markets, you will find coronaviruses, you will find influenza viruses, you will find known human pathogens, but of course you will also find a lot of novel viruses that might be the next pandemic virus, but of course you don't know at that stage. And you really only see that at the time at which they reach their market, because that whole upstream trading puts all these different animals together in terrible conditions that end up with getting infected from other animals in the same chain.
Yeah, I mean, that was what we all saw in Contagion, right? Like they traced it. That's what I loved about that movie is they traced it back to where it started with that amazing scene at the end. I can only guess that at the beginning of all of this were your original thoughts like this probably happened because of the wildlife trade.
Actually, my first thought was that there's got to be a lab leak. I mean, that's the
Really?
that's the part of my foray into this is that I knew about the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I knew about the fact that they would do chimeric viruses, that they're working on coronaviruses. They were collecting viruses from the wild and trying to grow them in tissue culture in the lab. And initially, when I took a look at this and saying, oh, there's a few features of SARS-CoV-2 that sort of look peculiar to me, pretty quickly, I went straight to the lab leak and said, look, it's got to be that, right?
Wow.
But then, of course, I started thinking about it more and really importantly had many conversations with colleagues, the colleagues that then end up publishing together with, where I and they realized that actually that doesn't really make any sense because, first of all, the things that we thought looked peculiar to SARS-CoV-2, in fact, are not peculiar to SARS-CoV-2. Things like a furin cleavage site that you might have heard about.
Oh, yeah.
We find those come and go. Yeah, we've heard that a lot, right? But that comes and goes across coronaviruses, including beta coronaviruses that SARS-CoV-2 is. And even though SARS-CoV-2 is the first what's called a subbecovirus, the first subspecies, with a furin cleavage site, we see these widely across many other coronaviruses, including the common cold coronaviruses. I just didn't know that initially because while I study the origin of outbreaks and viral emergence, I was not an expert on coronaviruses.
Mm-hmm.
So I was new to studying coronaviruses specifically, but had done this with many other viruses like Ebola, Lassa, Zika, as I mentioned, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I had a lot of updating of my own knowledge as I went into this particular question. But yeah, when I initially put all of this together, it's like, that's got to be a lab leak. I mean, the lab is right there, except it's not, right? It's actually 20 kilometers away from that market. But of course, early on, it also wasn't clear exactly how strong that connection to the market is. But it turns out it is very strong.
Yeah, and now you're confident that a lab leak has been ruled out?
Yeah, I will say the evidence we have available today, and even the early evidence back in early 2020, really shows that a lab leak, while not impossible, right? This is important to understand, that we're not saying that anything is not off the table at this stage, but it is extremely unlikely, to the point that, in my opinion, it's implausible that it could have come from a lab. And it's simply because when we're looking at the evidence itself, for example, all the early cases cluster around the market itself. That really only happens when an infection starts in a place that then spreads from there. We even see further example of that during the pandemic, where other clusters pop up, other places in China around markets, where we see exactly the same picture, where cases start clustering around the place in which the outbreak itself started. Of course, inside the market itself, the environmental positivity of the virus clusters in the corner of the market in which we now know they were selling wild animals like raccoon dogs and civet cats, which a priori we had expected could be potential intermediate hosts. Mm-hmm. And we even find samples in which we find evidence of the virus and those wild animals in the very same sample itself.
So why do you think the intelligence community still favors the lab leak hypothesis?
The intelligence community doesn't actually favor the lab leak hypothesis. There's a few intelligence communities, like the FBI, for example, and the DOE, do favor the lab leak, but the rest of them, I believe it's 5 others, actually favor zoonosis. So in terms of like just, the overall picture is pointing from their perspective to zoonosis. But what is interesting between, the FBI, and we've got a little bit of insights into why they believe it came from a lab. And it essentially comes back to exactly my first intuition, which was the lab is right there and they're working on the viruses. But they don't appear to actually have looked at any of the scientific evidence. What's also really important here is that they seem to favor different labs. One is the FBI, I believe, is the Wuhan CDC, which is not the Wuhan Institute of Virology, right? It's in a completely different location, versus the DOE, which seem to favor the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And what's important here is that that's not the same hypothesis, right? We're talking about 2 completely different labs. So of course you can't collapse them into saying like, yes, so that is the same. It is not, right? Mm-hmm. Those are 2 mutually exclusive possibilities.
Do you think that part of it is the fact that China is not totally forthcoming with information? And related to that, do you think we could get closer to an answer in terms of like the actual pathway of the zoonosis if we had unfettered access from China?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that China has been obscuring the origin question in general. And of course, China has not handed over everything anybody has ever asked of them. But I think the important bit there is that, like, what country would do that? Imagine that we had a cluster outbreak here in the United States and China was demanding all our lab notebooks.
Right.
I don't think that people would be forthcoming with that immediately, right? But I think the important bit here to understand too is that for this to happen and coming out of China is embarrassing to China no matter how you look at it, because post the SARS outbreak back in early 2000, right? This was not supposed to happen. They set up all sorts of detection systems that should detect these outbreaks early and then not cause a pandemic from there. So, of course, this is a deep embarrassment to China in general. And whether it came from the lab or wet market, those are equally bad if you look at it from the perspective of China, right? Which is why when you're looking at the prevailing theories and the prevailing belief in China is that they don't believe that COVID-19 even came from China. Right. In fact, the most favored theory in China is that it came from a US lab. About half of Chinese, when polled for it, believe that it came out of a US biolab. exactly the same as if you poll the Americans, about half of them or more believe that it came out of a Chinese lab, right? It is completely the same theory. It's reversed.
And of course, that points to propaganda and rhetoric, but the Sego conclusions were that even the Chinese hypothesis that it didn't start in the Wuhan market but was imported from some other market somewhere else, even that seemed to be somewhat implausible. I want to point out, because I think it's just important to reiterate what a beautiful example this is of the scientific method in process, that you as an individual scientist, but one who runs a lab, basically went in saying, ooh, it's probably this other thing. And you, after looking at the data, you were like, nope, I'm actually convinced it's not.
Correct. I mean, this is sort of like my progression through, the experience of studying this question, and then this becoming a very politicized question, was that the sort of criticism people were leveling against me very early on was that they were saying on social media, Twitter back then, that we never even considered a lab leak a possibility. And I was pretty forceful in pushing back and saying, like, no, actually we did. And not just that, I actually thought it was pretty likely. But people then said, oh, but you're just saying that. You're lying about that. We don't believe that to be true, right? And then, of course, I had some emails with Tony Fauci, Dr. Fauci, that became public, where, my first email to him, where I very specifically tell him that, look, I think this could come from a lab. We need to look at it much more closely. We have a good team lined up, so we should know more in the days to come. But once that email came out, that basically proved my point, which was that clearly I think it came from the lab in that email, as I have been saying. But then it switched around to like, oh, so then actually he always believed it came from the lab, but now he's just saying that it came from nature because Dr. Fauci told him to, right?
Oh,
which is such a good example. Is like, no, it's actually not that, right? It's just that I started researching this question a little bit more critically, coming from a first point of, general confusion, right? But saying like, look, I think it could be this. But then realizing relatively quickly by, again, doing analyses, looking at the data, learning a lot more, which of course has continued over the years since, right? To realizing that first hunch hypothesis that I had was just not correct.
And you also reached out to people with more specific expertise than you, which is interesting too, because again, the public thinks, oh, you're a virology expert, you have all the expertise that is needed. But no, scientists recognize the limits of their own area of expertise. I mean, there's always somebody more expert than you, or even if they have the same level of expertise, they may be giving you a different perspective or have different ideas. The community aspect of scientific thinking and exploration is often underappreciated by the public, because that's not the narrative we see in movies, right? It's always the lone genius maverick, who's immediately correct and then gets suppressed by the bad guys. That's the narrative they know.
That's exactly right. And I am, these days, I am an evolutionary virologist, right? But my training, I'm actually an immunologist by training. So I did my PhD, was in immunology in Cambridge, in the UK, where back then, I should say, I started listening to the SGU. So as I mentioned to you in the email, is that I've been listening to the SGU when I was a graduate student, and now I'm a tenured professor. I'm still listening.
Awesome.
But back then was as an immunologist. But then when I started doing my postdoc at Harvard back in 2009, that's when I started focusing on infectious diseases and evolutionary aspects of that. So no, I'm not an expert on everything. I am, again, an expert on understanding viral emergence. But as I mentioned, like coronaviruses specifically was not really my area of expertise. And that's exactly right, because I knew some of my colleagues have studied MERS, for example, and SARS-1 and novel coronaviruses. So once we started talking together and could share our ideas and could sort of, discuss all the different hypotheses on the table, including with international experts that literally only study coronaviruses, is that we just realized that, look, there's actually a lot that we don't know currently. And as we are updating our knowledge base on coronaviruses, the different features, the evolutionary history that we see across many, different coronavirus species, is that, that's a big part of it. And then of course also just saying like, look, we actually do have some evidence here. And data. Let's take some time to sit down and analyze that and see what do we get out of those analyses. And that again is something that has continued for years, right? Our latest papers was in 2024, right? So it's not just something that from one day to the next, all of a sudden now you have the full knowledge, right? It takes time.
Yeah, it's a process. And for the record, at any point, did the powers that be, did anybody try to keep you from talking about the lab leak hypothesis or suppress it in any way? Because that's now part of the narrative, even though I never, saw that.
It's always part of the narrative, right? That the scientists were suppressed. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the narrative is that I'm the one doing the silencing apparently, and if I were, I'm pretty bad at that, because I have literally not heard anything other than about the lab leak since I think 2021. But no, of course not. I mean, the narrative that is out there is that Dr. Fauci, for example, had a preferred narrative, which is it must have been coming from nature. And that's just untrue. He didn't. In fact, when I initially talked to him and I explained to him what our concerns were, he said to me on the phone was that, well, if you think it came from the lab, you should write an article on it, or you should consider writing an article on it. So not only did he not try to suppress me on talking about the lab leak, he actually did the opposite. And of course, throughout this whole period is that there has been no suppression of any specific version of this or any wish that it must be this or it must be that. Because from a scientific perspective, you just can't do that. Right? It just doesn't make any sense that you would try and saying like, oh, we can only talk about this and then we'll ignore everything else. Right? This is not how scientific process works in general. So no, there's never been any suppression or any sort of push towards a quote unquote preferred narrative.
Right. And trying to get scientists on the same page, again, it's like herding cats. They have, a famous independent streak. Like they would love nothing more than to say the man is trying to keep my research down, but I'm going to get it out there to the world or whatever. Like I know I've worked with a lot of scientists. There's no way they would go down with that.
No, and I mean, especially I should say the kind of scientists that we're talking about here. I mean, myself, but also my colleagues that I have. I mean, we're very opinionated, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we got our opinions, right? So of course, if there's things that we disagree on, we will debate that robustly, and we did, and we do. So trying to like herd those cats of international scientists, which now is, because you're looking at our papers, now we're talking about, 30 odd authors or so, and getting them all on the same page and saying like, look, here's exactly how it's going to be. I mean, it's literally impossible, right? It's just, but that's what the data points to.
Yeah.
Right. And the data is not tied to any specific, like when you're looking at early cases, for example, it's not that is specifically tied to pointing into zoonosis, right? It's just that the cases, they just happen to cluster very closely around the market. Of course, had they clustered very closely around the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and maybe the biosafety cabinets, like the environmental samples at the market, had been the ones that were positive for the virus, of course, our conclusions would have been, well, this clearly came from the lab, right? The early cases cluster around it. But that's just not what the data actually is, right? The data is just the part that points directly to the market itself.
Is there anything specific that you think we should be doing that we're not doing to keep the same thing from happening again? Because it sounds like that market was just a setup for a zoonotic spillover.
Well, not just that one, right?
Is it still that way now, or were any changes made? What needs to be done?
Right, but like markets in general, right?
Yeah, markets in general, to Kara's point. And actually, Kara, you mentioned you visited southern China. What's crazy about this whole this whole like going through the origin investigations here is my colleague Eddie Holmes, who's from Australia, is in Australia. He was actually taken to the Huanan seafood market in 2014 by the Wuhan CDC, the China CDC at the time. And Eddie took photos of raccoon dogs, which are, they were one of the hosts for SARS-CoV-1 and a likely host for SARS-CoV-2, sitting on top of birds, and literally, droppings on top of the birds, right? And Eddie took
I have photos like that in my phone. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And Eddie took this photo because he was like, oh my God, here's, raccoon dogs, highly likely as coronavirus, vectors, and sitting on top of birds for flu vectors. And he took that photo because he's like, well, that seems like a bad idea. And of course, the crazy thing is that, this was in 2014 at the Huanan seafood market itself.
That's insane.
It is absolutely insane, and it's in our papers. And what is even crazier is that it's in fact from the stall that, if you look at our papers, it very much points to that could be the likely actual specific origin. But the reason for this, of course, is that, again, Eddie took these photos because we know this is such high risk. And then the question is, and markets are just high risks for you. Because market is this perfect examples in which we take wild animals, we put them into terrible conditions during weeks and months of transport until they end up in the markets. And of course, in markets, you have dense human urban centers, right? So if something were to spill over, there's also the likelihood that it can then continue from there because the human population density is so high. So those are the risk factors. The question is, and we know these well. So the question is, what do you do? And a lot has been talked about then we should ban it. But the problem is that trying to ban something like wild markets is extremely difficult. Some people rely on it for the food source, of course. Some people prefer it, and therefore it gets purchased. So I think an outright ban, while I would like to see that, I think is going to be difficult.
Well, also people are just going to do it in the shadows, and then they won't be monitored. Yeah, so that's the problem, is that people might just continue doing the trading, but now fully on the illegal path. Although I should say much of the trade we are talking about is actually illegal within these markets. We know several vendors, including the vendor I was talking about, were fined during 2019, for example, for selling illegal wildlife. Of course, what we could do is the monitoring aspect, right? So saying like, look, we know that this is ongoing, but we got to keep monitoring of what pathogens do we see at these market. And if a flag is thrown up, like here is something that is problematic, we need to be able to shut it down at that point. And that is something I think we could realistically do as we're talking about the wildlife trade, not just in market, but as the animals, for example, end up in that trade itself. I will say, though, that one thing as we are studying these viruses is that this is going to happen again. The question is when and where and with what virus. We don't know these questions, right? And when it happens the next time, what I'm really worried about is because of the politicization around not just the origin question, but COVID-19 and infectious diseases in general, is that I'm actually really worried that the next time something like this might happen is that the sort of incentive of countries to report early on them. On these events is now less than when the COVID-19 pandemic kicked off. For the simple reason that you've seen, a lot of this again being politicized and then also vilified. So I think the next time, the willingness to study these kinds of questions, the willingness to do the reporting, I'm quite worried is going to be a lot less than what we saw with COVID-19 back in 2020.
Oof. Yeah, it's a more dangerous world.
It is a more dangerous world, unfortunately, for many different reasons.
Yeah. All right, Christian, thank you so much for joining us. It was really great to have you on the show.
Yeah.
It's time for Science or Fiction.
Each week, I come up with 3 science news items or facts, 2 real and 1 fake, and then I challenge my panel of skeptics. Tell me which one is the fake. Are you guys ready for just some regular news items this week?
Yes.
Regular.
All right, here we go. Well, they're irregular.
Oh.
Item number 1, the largest and most recent survey on the topic in the UK finds that nearly 1 million people had their drinks spiked in the previous year. Item number 2, researchers demonstrate that humans can be sexually aroused by some of the mating calls of non-human animals. And item number 3, neuroscientists find that they can make people more hypocritical, less morally consistent, by modulating a specific part of the brain. Jay, go first.
All right, the first one, the largest and most recent survey on the topic in the UK finds that nearly 1 million people had their drinks spiked in the previous year. Okay, wow, that's a lot of people.
That's in the UK only, yeah.
Wow, that's a lot of people, if that's true. I find that very hard to believe, because that would mean that, I mean, if there's repeat offenders, which I would imagine there would be with an activity like that, but let's say that, you know, one person on average was spiking 4 people. That's 250,000 people spiking other people on my ginned up mathematics here. But still, it's a lot of people that would have to be doing something like that. Terrible. Second one, researchers demonstrate that humans can be sexually aroused by some of the mating calls of non-human animals. What? No. No. Get out of here with that. That humans, he didn't say some humans, he said that humans can be sexually aroused. What?
No, that doesn't mean every single human would be.
Well, it's a big difference between like a lot of people and like 3. You know what I mean? So,
At least 1, at least 2, because it's plural.
Okay, great. 2. That is plausible then, because there's people that are attracted to everything out there. You know, like, so sure. Why wouldn't there be a couple of people that? All right, I'll just take a sidestep away from that one. Neuroscientists find that they can make people more hypocritical, less morally consistent by manipulating a specific part of the brain. That one is 100% science to me. I know the mechanism that they would use. You know, they use like magnetic fields to do things like that with the brain. They're experimenting with this all the time. I'm not surprised that could happen. Going back to the first one, that's a lot of people. That is a lot of people getting drugged. I'll have to say that the second one with the people being attracted to animal calls, okay, yeah, 1, 2, 3 people maybe out there, they found that this is true. I think that's science. I think 1 million people did not get their drink spiked, you know, with what do they call it? A Molly? Is that the drug?
Could be.
Well, it doesn't say what it was spiked with.
It's probably a roofie, but I don't think most people are wasting MDMA on.
Oh, okay. So this could just be spiked with alcohol. That's different.
No.
Well,
I don't think it could be spiked with alcohol. It's probably a roofie.
So
Yeah.
the operational definition of spiked in this study was that something was put in their drink that they were not aware of.
Oh, okay.
So it could be
Okay.
anything.
It's not limited to a specific drug or anything specific.
Okay, I have to rethink this real quickly. I'll just stick with my guns. I think the first one is fiction.
Okay, Evan.
When I hear the word spiked, I think alcohol first, actually, right? You spiked the punch, you spiked the eggnog, right? That was the term to say alcohol was put into the drink.
Yeah, but again, in the study, they say anything the person wasn't aware, it was something was deliberately placed in their drink, and they were not aware that was done so.
And therefore, if you take a wider definition of it, then you could extrapolate that out perhaps to maybe the point where you do get to 1 million people. Are these people who believed that was true, or was? There's no way to prove it.
It's a survey.
Right?
It's a survey.
Okay,
people
so
were
just
asked,
they're in their experience. Okay, and some people think, you know, and I'm sure there's some false positives in there too. You know, people thought that something got put in there and it really wasn't, but that's how they reported it. So I think when you add all those things up, you could possibly get to 1 million. The second one, I don't know about this. Researchers demonstrate that humans can be sexually aroused by some of the mating calls of non-human animals. What would be the trick here? Why would falsifying this one? How do you falsify this one? They would be maybe sexually aroused by something other than the mating calls of non-human animals. Maybe the act of watching other animals mate or something like that could prove to be stimulating. I don't know about the calls, though. Have you heard some of the mating calls of these things? It sounds like torture. I would think it would be the opposite, right? Oh, get away from that as fast as you can. Ooh. So I don't know about that one. The last one, yes, I think neuroscientists making people more hypocritical, right? There are always ways to activate things and deactivate things in the brain. And like Jay said, magnets and other methods. So, why couldn't this be one of those things that can be manipulated? So I think it's the sexually aroused by mating calls is going to be the fiction.
Okay. Kara?
Yeah, I mean, this one's weird and tough. I don't see any problem with nearly 1 million people having their drinks spiked within the year. I mean, I do see a huge problem with it. Yeah. I don't see any problem with that being the science. I know a lot of people who, and mostly women, who have, and I've seen a lot of experiments about bystander effect where people don't do anything about it. Ugh. So that one worries me, but it doesn't worry me that it would be fiction. Also, neuroscientists finding that they can make people more hypocritical, that is less morally consistent by modulating a specific part of the brain. I'm with Jay on this one. I'm guessing this is a transcranial magnetic stimulation study. TMS can knock out functionality in parts of the brain that are really specified. And so you can temporarily induce a behavior change and then it goes away pretty quickly. So I don't see why they wouldn't be able to do it with this paradigm, make this person morally inconsistent by knocking out, some area of the brain. I guess there are big implications to that, and I hope people don't run with this and say oh, you knock out this part of the brain and you become evil or something like that. But definitely, I think you could change behavior.
This brain switched to evil.
Yeah, exactly. But I do think you could change behavior, like decision-making behaviors and things like that with a knockout study with a TMS. So I guess that does just leave the sexually aroused. I mean, here's the thing. We know that humans can be sexually aroused by animals. It is a paraphilia, which is thanks for opening this can of worms, Steve. But we know that bestiality exists. We know that, I think it's called zoophilia, it exists, but the whole is it the mating calls that is starting the attraction or whatever. I bet you just made up this study and that researchers did not demonstrate this, even though it may or may not be true.
Okay, and Bob.
1 million people in the UK. So how many people are in the UK? I don't know, but 50 million, 55 million seems reasonable. One in 50, and if it's mostly women,
yeah, it's exactly 1 in 50. Bob, you got that right.
Ooh, nice, Bob.
Oh no! Oh, really? Damn. So if it were mostly women, then we're talking what 1 in 25, 1 in 30, 1 in 20. That, yeah, I don't know about that one. That seems, yeah. These are tough. The number 2, the mating clause. I'm not going to put restraints on anything that turn anybody on because it's all over the place. I mean, so yeah, I mean, but Kara's right. I mean, it is just the mating call. I mean, it's not, I would think, especially for guys, to be something much more visual than audible. But and then this last one here, yeah, TMS. I mean, that totally makes sense that, TMS could do that. And I in fact, I'm looking forward to the future where they really develop the crap out of that technique and do some crazy shit with the brain. But so that totally makes sense, unless there's something weird about being hypocritical that they can't knock out. I don't know. Yeah, I'll go with the mating call one and say that's fiction. Although it wouldn't surprise me at all if it's not. But yeah. Got to pick something.
Okay, so you all agree on the third one, so we'll start there. Neuroscientists find that they can make people more hypocritical, less morally consistent, by modulating a specific part of the brain. You all think this one is science, and this one is science. This one is science. Yeah, this is pretty easy, but, got to throw some easy ones in there. The part of the brain, where do you think it is in the brain, just generally in the brain?
The inconsistency part or the moral?
Where in the brain is the thing that they're modulating?
To make them more hypocritical.
Yeah, it's definitely frontal lobe, right? It's the ventromedial prefrontal cortex.
Okay.
Oh, I was going to say that next.
The VMPFC.
No, I wasn't.
So they've used functional MRI scan to show that this part of the brain's active when they're making this moral decision. And the paradigm that they used was they gave them a task, this is a common thing in this kind of psychological research, where they could make actual real money, right? But in order to make money, or the more they lie, the more money they make. And they had them do the task and then say, how did you do? And then they assess their own moral behavior. And then they had them watch other people doing the same task and say how they did, and from extremely immoral to extremely moral. And so when judging their own behavior, they were more likely, or they weighted profit more. And when evaluating other people's behavior, they weighted honesty more. So again, another aspect of the fundamental attribution error.
Right.
But so there was an inconsistency there at baseline, right? People were hypocritical at baseline. They're being judgmental about the behavior in other people that they're engaging in themselves. But that became more intense when they used transcranial magnetic stimulation to inhibit. They just say modulate, but it must be inhibit, the VMPFC. So they say transcranial temporal interference stimulation was the term that they used.
Mm-hmm.
So they think that this part of the brain is involved with evaluating morality, right? And in weighing moral consistency, right? And saying, this is dishonest and dishonesty is bad, so I shouldn't do it. And if you disrupt that, they don't have that moral connection and they just do what's profitable. They just...
Oh, man. That could explain a lot of people I know.
Well, yeah.
Interesting.
Everything's variable. All right, let's go back to number one. The largest and most recent survey of the topic in the UK finds that nearly 1 million people had their drinks spiked in the previous year. Jay, you think this one is fiction. Everyone else thinks this one is science. And this one is also science. Sorry, Jay. Yeah, this one is science. That's a lot of people.
Yeah, man.
It is a lot.
This is a survey, so this is just people saying, hey, have you had your drink spiked in the last year? And that's how many people said yes.
Oh, geez. So that's just the people who know it happened.
Yeah, right?
Or who believe it happened.
So it might be even more, right?
Yeah.
But these are people who
Probably
believe that they were. So women were 58% of cases, so it is more in women. The locations,
but not as much as I would have thought.
Yeah, they were bars. Yeah. At first, I'm like, why? What's happening with the other 52%? But 42%, right? But I'll tell you. I'll get to that in a second. 41% were in bars, 26% at social events, and 25% at nightclubs. So all drinking
And
situations.
drinking environments, of course.
Sure.
So they said the reason for doing it, the number one reason was sexual assaults. Right? Drug-facilitated sexual assaults, but also just robbing them. So people spike their drinks so that they could then rob them as they leave the bar or whatever. And sometimes, also listed was pranks. So a friend might do it to their friend as a quote-unquote
that's so
prank.
funny. Good prank.
Yeah, not a...
Jeez.
And in terms of what it was being spiked with, so sometimes it was alcohol. They didn't add alcohol to a drink that doesn't have alcohol. They just increase the amount of alcohol in an alcoholic drink.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So, you think this is one shot? It's actually 2 or 3 shots. So you consume way more alcohol than you think you are. So, but sometimes it was roofies. It was drugs. Meant to, make people susceptible, more vulnerable. So, the bottom line here is
it's an epidemic over there.
Be aware. First of all, people who do this are scumbags. Just have to say that.
Yes.
This is, come on. This is
even the
criminal.
pranksters.
Yeah, it's criminal. It's really a scummy thing to do, in my opinion. But for individuals, just have a lot. Don't drink something that somebody hands you. Right? I mean, you should have total control over anything that you consume, especially in a public setting like that, where this potential exists.
Yeah, you might trust your drink with a friend of yours as you go to the bathroom. You got to be really careful about that.
Yeah, I wouldn't do that.
Yeah,
I
but
would
even if
never
you're
consume
really
anything I
careful-
did not have complete control over at all times. You know what I mean?
Especially if you didn't bring a tricorder with you.
You'd be surprised, even if you have complete control over it, how shady some people can be.
Well, also you go to a restaurant,
I just say
trusting
that
whatever's happening in the kitchen.
Well, no, but I just mean like, especially for women who are out and about or who are on a first date or who are in a very busy bar or something like that. Like I say that because I think, I'm not saying people are going to think this, but like if your drink gets spiked, it is not your fault because you weren't vigilant enough.
It's very hard to be so vigilant that it doesn't happen.
Exactly. Like if someone wants to do it, they will figure out a way to do it.
Yeah,
don't make it easy.
The bartender. They could pay the bartender.
Exactly.
You'll never notice it.
Or distract you, have their friend distract you while they do
just
it.
a
The drink's
second,
in your hand the whole time. It doesn't take that long. And also, if you see, I know that this is like whatever, but like if you see something, say something.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you witness even something that you could be accidentally taken as that, it's worth it to throw the drink out to save,
Absolutely.
Yeah, like just
have each other's
say
back.
something.
100%. Yeah. Please watch out for your family.
But people
and
don't.
friends.
They often don't.
Yeah. It's a very chaotic situation with people who are often compromised on purpose.
Exactly. You're already vulnerable. You're already inebriated.
Yeah.
It's loud. It's it's just it's sad.
Yeah, also know where you are and who you're with. Definitely. Again, none of this is implying blaming the victim. It's just saying, you can, it's like saying, don't use an ATM in a place without any security, and take out a whole bunch of cash and flash it around.
Be smart. Don't make it easier. But at the same time, if it does happen, it's not because you did something to make it happen or you were asking for it.
Exactly. Okay. Which means that researchers demonstrate that humans can be sexually aroused by some of the mating calls of non-human animals is the fiction. But this was a study. I didn't make this up out of whole cloth. What it showed was that humans have a preference for the mating calls of other animals, meaning that they think it's a pleasant sound. Not that they're sexually aroused, though. So then what do they find it pretty, right? You might find the mating call of a bird pretty. And what they essentially played different sounds for people, and people preferred the same sounds that the animals preferred. So that is the thing that they were trying to get at. Would humans have the same kind of auditory preferences that a bird would have? And it turns out largely we do. They found broad overlap between human and animal sound preferences. And some of the ones that were common, like bird calls that contain trills, clicks, and chucks, people found, like these are what they call acoustic adornments, were highly favored by both people and animals.
Interesting.
Well, to some extent, all vertebrate brains are related, right? We all have a common ancestor with a brain.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that it wasn't like this widespread weird thing,
Right. And also, it does raise an interesting question, too, about, well, why do we prefer some sounds over others? What's the underlying principle? Is it regularity, some kind of mathematical principle at work?
Symmetry or...
Yes, symmetry. There's obviously some features that are not just cultural, that are, baked in, that we share, even with relatives.
People find symmetry in faces more beautiful than asymmetry. I wonder if it applies to sound, potentially. I don't know.
If they equate it to mating and therefore procreation, do we have a disposition to sort of have a positive thoughts about that in general? Don't know.
But also, it's not limited to sound. That means the study was. But like, we find birds pretty. They're not pretty for us. They're pretty for each other. But we still find it pretty. You know what I mean?
Especially the men.
Yeah.
Peacocks, robins, the cardinals.
It's not always the male. That's a myth.
Ooh, well, I wasn't suggesting it was always the male.
It's actually way more often than you think. The males take care of the kids, and not the females. Or it's disproportionately the male birds, but it's not like universal as people think.
Well,
all right, Evan, give us a quote.
The truth will prevail in the end. Nonsense will fall of its own weight by a sort of intellectual law of gravitation. And that was written by Cecilia Payne Gaposchkin, female astronomer born in 1900, who in 1925 discovered what stars are made of, such as hydrogen, helium, and a dash of nearly every other element. That quote was submitted by a listener, Bob, from Marin County, California. Thank you, Bob.
Do you guys think that that's actually true?
That was huge.
In the truth will prevail in the end? Maybe not always, but nonsense.
I guess it depends on how far out the end is. You know what I mean? Like, it might not happen in one's lifetime.
I think it's also depends on the context. I think within the halls of science, that's true, because science has a process that favors the truth. But culturally, I don't think that that's true.
Well, I agree with that, and not sure she was speaking culturally. She was likely speaking scientifically.
She's a scientist.
She's an astronomer.
Probably speaking within the context of science, but she didn't qualify it in the statement. So I think she makes it sound like just a truism overall. So I would qualify it like, yes, in the right context, in the right situation or institution or culture or whatever, but not always. I don't think it's always true.
For sure.
Amazing. She was, for someone of that time, working on the cosmic makeup of the universe and nature of variable stars. And she determined that stars were composed primarily of hydrogen and helium in her 1925 doctoral.
Yeah, 25 years old.
Huge
cool.
discovery.
Oh my gosh, huge.
All right, well, thank you all for joining me this week.
Thank you, Steve.
You guys, Steve.
Steve.
And until next week, this is your Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. Skeptic's Guide to the Universe is produced by SGU Productions, dedicated to promoting science and critical thinking. For more information, visit us at theskepticsguide.org. Send your questions to info@theskepticsguide.org. And if you would like to support the show and all the work that we do, go to patreon.com/skepticsguide and consider becoming a patron and becoming part of the SGU community. Our listeners and supporters are what make SGU possible.